Hi, for those of you in AML 6506 who wanted some tips for writing a journal article, this is just a short crash course, and I'm happy to talk about this more with you if you have questions as they come up. Step one is to locate your scholarly conversation. Any paper probably has more than one focus. You want to rank what those focuses are. For example, if you want to write about trauma theory in Wieland, I would ask, do you think you're primarily helping us think about trauma theory in a new way, or making the case for a different reading of the novel? Which scholarly conversation are you contributing to first? I don't want you to break it down to only do one thing. I actually think that the strongest papers are going to do both. So you're not going to just apply a theory to Wieland. You're going to also talk about how Wieland helps us think about that theory reciprocally. You want to be doing more than one thing, but you need to have a sense of what's the top thing that you're doing. What's the most important conversation you're contributing to. Once you have a sense of that top thing, get a sense of that scholarly conversation by reading widely on the subject you ranked first. Do not only read articles that are directly about the intersection between trauma theory and Wieland. So don't go to Project Muse or JSTOR and just look up trauma and Wieland to write your article. You might do that to write a paper for your class, but when you're writing an article, if you rank Wieland first, you want to read anything that people have published in the last few years about Wieland in general, because you want to help them see how the theory that you're going to bring in secondarily contributes to that larger conversation and not just to a super niche, super focused one. So if you, in the example that I gave, if you choose that you're mostly contributing to thinking about Wieland first and secondarily to trauma, you'd read anything that people have published about Brown, maybe even cast a slightly wider net and look to see what people are saying about trauma and early American literature more broadly, see if there's anything from that kind of larger circle you want to talk about too. And then use citation track. Look at who is always cited. So if you look at anyone who's published about Wieland, let's say in the last 5 years, go right to their bibliographies. You will eventually want to read all those articles, but make sure that you've read everyone who's cited most of the time, because that's part of the conversation. If everyone's still citing an article that came out in 1987, you might have originally been like, oh, this is old, I don't want to think about it. But obviously there's a reason that people that are still publishing are referring back to it. It might have been a field-changing article that people need to grapple with. So paying attention to citations and really tracking them can help you make sure that you position yourself in a conversation in an effective way. And that brings us to step two. Think about who your readers might be. I mean, both your blinded readers who might get an anonymous copy of this essay and decide whether it's publishable, it should be revised or resubmitted, or outright rejected, and also your larger audience of academics. When you think about what scholars might review your text, it's probably people who've been publishing on these subjects recently. Do you treat their work fairly? Are you citing them? Are you just being critical and dismissing them out of hand? Or are you making a case for how your work complements, extends, engages with what they've already done? And how can you convince your broader audience of the timeliness and importance of your work? That involves making sure that you summarize the scholarly conversation you want to contribute to. So you did all that work, you citation traced, you read a bunch of recent articles, you read anything that's relevant to your sort of subset question, and you, in just a few lines, maybe a paragraph, you have a sense of what people have been saying. Then you want to point out a gap that your argument is going to fill. And then this is the most important part. Explain why it's important to fill that specific gap in the way that you do. A lot of people will say, here's the scholarly conversation, here's a gap, I'm filling that gap, but not why. If you can make a case for why it's important to read things in the way that you're reading it, what do we get out of it? That's so what. That's really important to actually getting your paper published. The trickiest thing is that this should all be clear in the first few paragraphs. I think that you're going to have lots of time to go back and flesh out the scholarly conversation and your positioning to it throughout. But by paragraph 2, I should know roughly what's the conversation you're intervening in. I should know that you have decided to privilege Wieland over trauma theory, but that you're reading the two together. And I should know why I should care to keep reading your article. My rule of thumb is I want to do that by the end of the second paragraph generally, but definitely 100% by the middle of the way through page 2. You can read a lot of journal articles in this process and notice how they navigate this lit review and intervention to get a sense of what's customary. So how do they frame a conversation? Do they use signposting language like I argue XYZ? Do they say, while X people say this, I say Y? Do they not use signposting? What are some of the other techniques that they use? When do they introduce their thesis? There's going to be some variety there. I tend to, in my own writing, I tend to use signposting language to make it clear I'm intervening here. Here's why I think that's important. I do that mostly because I feel like readers are really tired, and if you make it obvious for them, you know, here's what I'm doing, here's why it's important, it's easier to accept that paper than to accept a paper that's more subtle. But sometimes it could be more eloquent to be more subtle at how you frame your intervention without signposting language. That's sort of a personal preference thing. But get a sense of how lit reviews come up, and how people position themselves in relationship to it. As you're reading journal articles, when you underline something and say, okay, this is the thesis that they're starting with, where does that appear? Is it on the first page? Is it in the first or second paragraph? That's the kind of thing that you can see just by reading other journal articles. Check out the MLA directory of periodicals. I'm actually going to take you there so that you get a sense of what this looks like. So if we start at the UNF library website, we're going to go to databases, and I'm going to go to M because it's MLA directory of periodicals. MLA directory of periodicals. Now I can't search Wieland here. This is a directory that tells us about the journals, not about the content of the journals, as you'll see. So I'm going to think of some other key terms that can help me think about where people are publishing about Wieland. The first thing that I'm going to be curious about is if there is a Charles Brockton Brown. Sometimes there might be. There's not a journal just about the author. There's like the Mark Twain Annual. Some authors have journals just about them. So I'm going to look up early American literature. There are 12, and I want to leave it to a journal that's actively indexed, so I narrowed it down here. There are 5 journals that are just about early American. And there's early American literature. Actually, that seems like the only one that's relevant to just early American, so I'm going to pull this up. Now, this looks like some weird information here, so I want to tell you what we're looking for. We see the frequency, how often it's published, 3 times a year. That's pretty large circulation for journal articles. And then we look at article suggested length, 2,000 to 7,000 words. So that's actually on the short side. Should not exceed 40 pages. They'd be willing to take things that are a little longer than 7,000 words, obviously. It's nice that they have this short range here. Number submitted per year, 120. Published per year, 15 to 18. So just to give you a sense, that means that, let's go on the short end. They're publishing about 12, 13% of the articles that are submitted to them. So if you submit to them, that's your ratio of getting accepted. There's other details in here, like it will tell you that it's peer reviewed. Yes, that's something that you want to see. Okay, so they don't have early American literature as a major field. Let's look at American literature and see what comes up. Now we have sort of a larger sense of, there's a much longer list. Some of these are obviously not going to be great for us, like, studies in American Jewish literature aren't really going to matter to your thinking about Wieland. Let's look at American literature. This journal has an even larger circulation. It is peer-reviewed. Number of submissions. So you could see that their ratio is lower than 10%. It's a little bit more elite than the early American literature. 24 are published out of 250. Let's look at 18th century, since Wieland was published in the 18th century. There's studies in 18th century culture. So that's another journal that you might look up. Peer-reviewed, yes. Number submitted per year, 100, published per year, 15. So this has a higher ratio of acceptance. Now, out of curiosity, let's see if there are journals that specifically focus on the Gothic. So there's Gothic studies. Look at this one. This will be the last one that we look at. Peer-reviewed, yes. Submission details, submitted per year, 30, published per year, 20. So this has a very, very high acceptance rate. What you'd want to know, though, is, are they publishing, they say all periods of the Gothic. So that means that they potentially could be interested in something that's very early. But when you actually read them, if they're mostly publishing things that are from the present, then you're going to just want to make a case in that framing that I talked about when I say, why is it timely to think about this issue now? You're just going to want to make it clear that it helps us think about the Gothic even today if you're talking about something historical. So check out the MLA Directory of Periodicals. As I showed you, you might want to look up a bunch of different key terms. Rank the journals that you want to send your article to and keep that list at hand. You cannot send multiple submissions at once. And sometimes the same reader might be asked to read it if you submit to 2 different journals and whistleblow on you. You absolutely cannot send to 2 journals at once. It can take a really, really long time to hear back from these journals. I submitted something in 2013 that first came out in 2017. I didn't hear back that it was revised and resubmit until like 2.5 years later. Then I revised it, sent it back. It's a long process. So you can decide if your ranking is going to be like, oh, that Gothic literature one has a much higher ratio. I'm going to submit to them first because I want something that's more likely. Or if you want to go based on prestige and send it to a journal that is more selective, that's entirely up to you. But you should have a sense of a list of where you want to send it to. And the minute that you receive a rejection, send it out to the next one. It's gonna hurt. You're gonna get a lot of rejections. And when I get rejections, I cry. It hurts to get rejected. But if you have that list at hand and then you just send it right out to the next one, remind yourself that one rejection is not a consensus. It means that one person read it, didn't like it. Unfortunately, if you get a rejection, you probably won't get feedback. When you start getting 4 or 5 rejections, then you know that you probably need to reframe and deeply revise your article. But almost every article that I have written, I sent to one place, got a rejection, sent to another place, got and accepted with revisions, and then I did those revisions. So sometimes they'll tell you, one of my rejections specifically said, we just accepted 2 essays on Ellison that hadn't been published yet, so there was no way I could know that. But that wasn't about me. Most of the time they won't tell you anything, but you just send it right back out. You might retool the introduction a little bit if you're sending it to one journal versus another. So obviously, like a journal that's pitched to Gothic studies is going to have a little different framing than a journal that's pitched to early American scholars. But I try to send it back out the same day I get a rejection because it just takes the sting away. It feels like putting an ice pack on the wound of rejection to me. Um, Step 4, revise, peer review, polish. So you know your scholarly conversation, you have your rank of your journals, you know how you want to frame things. Get as many eyes on your paper as possible now that you're trying to actually build up the paper for that conversation. You want it to be well revised, coherent, and clear. People are sometimes rejected and not even sent to a peer reviewer because the writing is not good enough yet. So when you have your ranking of journals that you hope to submit to, read a few issues of that journal cover to cover to get a sense of style and custom. That's not usually how we do research in master's programs. Like you might look up your theme and just click on one article. But instead, when you go to Project Muse and you find actually, I'll show you what I mean here. So I'm going to go to Project Muse. Project Muse lets you browse. So you can use this to specifically find I'm going to browse journals. I find this slow, but I'm just going to pull it up as a way to do. So you can search by keyword. So I could search by early. Oh, that's publisher. Nope, no, I don't want the publisher. I want the journal. Early American Studies, an interdisciplinary journal. So let's say that this is a journal that we want to look at. I'll go to the journal itself, and then I'll go to the most recent issue and literally read every single thing in that issue. Then I'll go to the issue before that, the issue before that, the issue before that, read 5 issues cover to cover to get a sense of what the conversation in this journal looks like. Another way to do it would be, let's say we're looking for Wieland and trauma. I only want journals. Okay, so this is an 18th century studies. I could go to this particular essay and then read this essay that's interesting to me, and then go to 18th century studies. And again, do the same thing. What have they published recently that came from 2010? What has the conversation looked like more recently? Have other people talked about Brown in this journal since then, etc. So you go through the journals that you're interested in, you get a sense of style and custom, particularly for the one that you're hoping to send to first. If you're interested in additional resources, there's a book called Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks, and it's sort of like a workbook. I have not used this book myself, but I've had students use it before and they found it really useful. So that's just something that you might be interested in. I'm 99% sure our library has it. And that's the end. So that should help you think about what it looks like to publish an actual scholarly journal article. You don't have to do all of that work for this paper, but if you're doing option A, I assumed that you're probably interested in thinking about scholarly publication. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about what it looks like. Please feel free to contact me with questions if you have any, and happy writing.